The men still standing were barely recognisable. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, their faces and hands black with cordite and dust. The messenger carried an offer of honourable surrender from the renowned Boer general, Koos de la Rey. But the garrison's British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hoare, propped up in his sickbed, shaking with malaria, responded, "I cannot surrender. I'm in command of Australians, who would cut my throat if I did." This is the story of the Battle of Eland's River, August 1900, in South Africa. But before we go on, what are those Australians doing in South Africa fighting the Boers anyway? The Second Anglo-Boer War, which started in October 1899, is often remembered as a British versus the Boer republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State conflict. But actually, the British Army was an army formed from across her vast empire. Some 23,000 Australians, 6,000 New Zealanders, 8,000 Canadians and over 1,000 Rhodesians were also there, just like they would be, in far greater numbers, in 1914 and 1939. For the Australians, this was the first foreign conflict their troops ever fought in. Australians from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia and Tasmania were all at Eland's River when that young Boer messenger arrived. During the war, the Australians adapted to the African veldt faster than almost any other component of the British force. Many were, like their enemy, mounted farmers back home, and they were fighting in terrain that felt familiar and where they were more at home fighting like Boers than most regular British Army units were. Initially not welcomed by many in the British Army, they swiftly started to show their worth. Indeed, just 10 days before Eland's River in July 1900, Lieutenant Neville Howells, serving with the New South Wales Medical Corps, became the first Australian to be awarded the Victoria Cross. The next month came the epic defence at Eland's River, where a group of Australian and Rhodesian volunteers did what many regular troops might not have done. By August 1900, the capitals of the two Boer republics, Bloemfontein and Pretoria, had fallen, and the British commander, Lord Roberts, had declared the war essentially over. However, the Boers begged to differ. They now embarked on a guerrilla war for nearly 2 years. Living off the land, they targeted British supply depots and columns to make up for their dwindling supplies of food, clothing, horses, and most importantly, munitions. And just such a supply depot was located at Brakfontein Drift on the Eland's River on the road between Mafeking and Pretoria. The man commanding the supply depot was a veteran of the Siege of Mafeking, British officer Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hoare. His garrison was almost entirely colonial: 105 New South Wales citizens bushmen, 141 Queenslanders, 42 Victorians and a handful of Western Australians and Tasmanians, along with 200 Rhodesians, 3 Canadians and just 3 British regulars. Also in the camp were 30 loyalist Boer settlers, families who had accepted the British conquest and were awaiting escort to safety, eyed nervously by some of the garrison who weren't entirely certain where their loyalties ran. The senior Australian officer present was Major Walter Tombridge. Born in Kent in England, the son of a bricklayer, he'd built a successful life in Townsville, North Queensland. Commissioned into the mounted infantry and actually called out during the 1891 shearers' strike, he was now commanding the 3rd Queensland Mounted Infantry in South Africa. Commanding the New South Wales contingent was Captain James Francis Thomas, the King of Tenterfield they called him back home. 38 years old, this lawyer, newspaper proprietor and published poet was a man of some standing in northern New South Wales. In the weeks before the siege, riding patrols through the countryside, Thomas had noticed something interesting. Almost no modern Mauser rifles were being surrendered when Boers handed in their weapons. He mentioned this concern in his reports, and his concern was noted, but nothing was done. After all, Field Marshal Lord Roberts said the war was over. Indeed, many of the recently arrived Australians were now moaning that they had arrived too late to see any action. On the 3rd of August at Eland's River, when Captain David Ham ordered the men from Victoria to dig a protective trench, they chaffed at the pointless task and dug, whether entirely due to the stony ground or Australian belligerence, a trench that measured 6 inches in depth. That evening a campfire concert was held, singing, recitals, laughter, and meanwhile in the darkness, Koos de la Rey and his 2,000 Boers silently encircled the camp and moved their guns onto the high ground overlooking it. Those men complaining that they'd missed the action were about to get some, and more. The next morning, the 4th of August 1900, the fun of the concert was replaced by the scream of artillery shells. By nightfall, an estimated 1,700 shells had landed inside a 12-acre camp, destroying their telegraph link to the outside world and wreaking havoc amongst the 1,500 oxen, horses and mules being held at the depot. Petrified animals, many injured, stampeded around the camp, some dragging their torn entrails behind them. By the next day, over 1,000 were dead, either from Boer shells or had been put out of their misery by the defenders. And as the August sun rose, so too did the stench from their decaying and bloated corpses. The 500 British, colonial defenders found themselves surrounded by somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 seasoned Boer fighters and well over half a dozen guns. And all the defenders had in return was one obsolete 7-pounder, manned by the 3rd Queensland Mounted Infantry. Their position was centred around a farm about 1 kilometre, over half a mile, from the Eland's River. The river itself was their only water supply, and so to ensure that access to that water supply continued, the defenders fortified 2 small hills to the south of their main position, i.e. between the farm and the river. One hill was garrisoned by Australians under Richard Zouche of the New South Wales Citizen Bushman, and became known as Zouche's Kopje, or Hill. The other, closer to the river, was defended by 75 Rhodesians under Captain Sandy Butters. Incredibly, during that opening day's bombardment, not to mention the Boer sniper fire, just 5 defenders had been killed and a further 27 wounded. The first Australian deaths came in a trench commanded by Captain Thomas. Trooper John Waddell, 22 years old from rural New South Wales, was hit in the chest by a pom-pom round, dead within minutes. Trooper James Duff was killed by the same gun seconds later. Sergeant Major James Mitchell, wounded in the leg, was bandaged where he lay, as moving him to the hospital 400 metres away would probably have resulted in death from the Boer snipers. Those men from Victoria, who the day before had chaffed at digging trenches, now started digging for their lives. They were joined by the rest of the garrison. Not only did they dig trenches, but also underground bunkers. The following days settled into a brutal rhythm. Guns at dawn, relentless sniping throughout the heat, a feverish reconstruction of defences after dark. Stone sangers went up around the trench lines. Fighting pits were deepened and reinforced with crates, sacks and wagon wheels. Timber salvaged from the wrecked wagons provided overhead cover. Several positions were eventually linked by a tunnel dug by hand through the rocky shale. World War I had arrived 15 years early. And in those defensive positions, the men kept their heads down from Boer marksmen and the pom-pom quick-firing cannons that they were using, which sent shells in rapid sequence into the camp. All day the pom-poms pummeled the colonial troops at Eland's River, whilst their heavier guns, including the Boer's largest, a 15-pounder, added to the torment. Anyone venturing out over the open ground came under ferocious and accurate sniper fire. And all the while the temperature rose. The stink from the dead animals increased, and the water supplies started to run low. Throughout the siege, the men were reduced to an emergency ration of 1 quart, which is about 2 pints, of water a day. Not enough to rehydrate someone sitting down at a desk, let alone fighting a battle in the African sun. As I said earlier, the river was the garrison's only water supply, and was only accessible after dark. Small parties from the hill, being defended by Captain Sandy Butters and his Rhodesians, would work their way down to the river through the darkness to bring back whatever they could carry. Their outpost became known as Butters' Copy. The Boers realised that this hill was the key to the battle. Capture it, and the garrison's measly 2 pints of water per man per day would quite literally dry up. On the night of the 6th of August, they launched 2 attacks on Butters' Copy, but were beaten off. The following night, they tried again, this time sending 2,000 sheep in front of them to mask their advance. The ruse failed, and once more the Boers were driven back. Now, normally the Red Cross affords some sort of protection in battle, and it was flying above the little hospital at Elands River. Inside laboured Surgeon Captain Albert Duker. The Cambridge-educated medic was the son of a Hungarian-born Indian Army officer who had actually been knighted by the Emperor of Austria. Dr. Duker had emigrated to Mackay in Queensland and had quietly signed up when the war came. His hospital here at Elands River comprised of 3 ambulance wagons purchased by public subscription raised by the women of Queensland. Now those wagons, reinforced with earth, became the best protected structure in the whole camp. However, on the 8th of August, it was hit by a Boer shell. Sergeant Major James Mitchell, who had been hit on the first day, had finally been transferred from Thomas's Trench to the hospital. Now he was struck again. Despite his leg being amputated, he died of infection on the 12th of August and was buried in a small cemetery at the corner of the camp. In that cemetery also lay Lieutenant Annett, killed on the 6th of August. Annett was that kind of man the Victorian era seemed to produce, especially for dangerous situations. A Scottish-born veteran of 3 conflicts on 2 continents, he was elected as commanding officer by his own men in true Australian fashion, and he played that role with aplomb. Shortly after the siege at Elands River began, he stealthily led a 25-man patrol through the bush to attack a Boer pom-pom gun that had been causing the garrison particular trouble. Using the same sharpshooting skills as his enemy, Annett forced the Boers to retreat with their gun. His request to lead a nighttime attack to actually capture the gun was turned down as too risky. On the 6th of August, he was hit in the right eye and ended up at Dr. Duker's hospital. Incredibly, he survived and left later that day with just a bandaged head, only to be hit by shrapnel from a Boer shell. He died 15 minutes later. Trooper Corfe of the Queenslanders wrote home, "Ever since the commencement of the bombardment, Annett has been running from position to position, cheering and encouraging us all, regardless of the danger. None of us hesitate in saying that he was the best and bravest officer at Elands River." Lieutenant James Annett was just 36 years old and left a wife and 5 children back in Australia. By the time the hospital was hit, we were into day 4 of the siege, and there was no sign of rescue. But surely they weren't really being left to fend for themselves? Well, incredibly, the answer is yes, and all because of a terrible misunderstanding. When the telegraph wire went silent on day 1, a relief column under General Carrington had been sent to investigate. They were seen on the horizon by De la Rey, who immediately turned his men and guns to meet them. Carrington marched straight into a trap. The besieged garrison could hear his guns firing, and then the guns seemed to get further and further away until there was silence. Carrington had fallen back all the way to Mafeking, and then, having not heard any firing from the besieged supply depot, he signalled to Lord Roberts that the garrison had obviously surrendered. Roberts, acting on this report, called off a second relief attempt under Baden-Powell, which was approaching from the east. The future founder of the Boy Scouts turned back without confirmed sighting of the camp, 8 miles short. Roberts now turned his attention and resources to the pursuit of another large Boer commando, this time led by Christian de Wet. The men at Elands River were on their own. On the 8th of August, the same day as the hospital was hit, De la Rey's emissary, who we met at the beginning of this story, arrived under the white flag. The first officer he met was Butters, leading the Rhodesian contingent. Butters told the Boer messenger exactly what he could do with De la Rey's offer, but as he wasn't actually in overall command, he nevertheless had to escort him into the camp. Upon reading the offer, Lieutenant Colonel Hoare called a council of war. Sick with malaria, he was actually in favour of surrendering. His, however, was a lone voice. Butters angrily stated that Rhodesians didn't surrender, and that was echoed by Tunbridge. Australians would never surrender either. The messenger returned to the Boer general with that defiant message ringing in his ears. The siege continued. How and when would it end? Whilst the besieged garrison were in desperate straits, De la Rey had his own problems too. The whole reason for his attack was to capture the British supplies, especially the rifles and ammunition for his army, which was living off the land. What ammunition he now had was rapidly being used up in this fight. As the days went on, the Boer fire started to lose some of its ferocity. Not that the men down below, those Australians and Rhodesian defenders, felt they were being let off the hook. De la Rey now sent a message to fellow commander Christian de Wet, who was keeping one step ahead of a large column under General Kitchener, asking him to bring his forces to Eland's River to finish off the job together. Surely this would spell the end of the brave garrison. As the Boer messenger raced across the veldt on the 13th of August, he was intercepted by a British patrol and his message was read. Suddenly the British realised that the garrison, which they thought had fallen, was still very much alive and well, and very much fighting on. Lord Kitchener broke off his pursuit of de Wet and turned his whole column towards the beleaguered garrison. 2 whole brigades, 10,000 men, now covered 35 miles through the African veldt in 30 hours. On the morning of the 16th of August, Kitchener's column arrived and Koos de la Rey and his Boers melted away. Kitchener was greeted by the unshaven, black-faced defenders emerging from their holes. They had held out for 13 days, despite being outnumbered by anywhere between 4 and 6 to 1. It was, Kitchener commented, remarkable. He went on to praise the defenders, stating that only colonial troops could have put up that sort of resistance. Now, for those of you who know anything about Kitchener, that was almost emotional praise. The tributes came in from every direction. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who was serving in a British field hospital in South Africa at the time, wrote, "When the ballad makers of Australia seek for a subject, let them turn to Eland's River, for there was no finer fighting in the war." Boer commander and future Prime Minister of South Africa, Jan Smuts, would praise his enemy too. "Never in the course of this war," he wrote, "did a besieged force endure worse sufferings, but they stood their ground with magnificent courage. All honour to these heroes, who in the hour of trial rose nobly to the occasion." Not everyone in the campaign came out of it well. Carrington, the man who turned away and then reported the garrison must have surrendered, was removed from command, you might be pleased to know. In 1901, some of the defenders reportedly sent Carrington a white feather. Lieutenant Colonel Hoare was sent back to Britain to recuperate and served out the rest of his career in a series of garrison postings. Albert Duker, who had operated on the wounded under bombardment for 13 days and whose hospital was shelled while the Red Cross flag flew, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. He returned to medicine and died in 1923. Sandy Butters, who with his Rhodesians had held the vital hill that ensured the garrison's water supply, also received the DSO. Walter Tunbridge would go on to serve in the First World War, commanding the 1st ANZAC Corps on the Western Front. He would be mentioned in dispatches 5 times and eventually promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. He died in Melbourne in 1943, aged 87. James Thomas sailed home to Tenterfield, a decorated soldier, 3 mentions in dispatches, the town's pride and joy. But his story doesn't end there. In 1902, Thomas would defend 6 officers during the court-martial of Breaker Morant, And that event is a story in its own right, and I will be telling it soon. In total, about 23,000 Australians served in the Boer War, and 520 of them were killed. At Gallipoli alone in the First World War, 7,500 Australians died. But at Eland's River, 15 years earlier, the men who held that 12-acre compound for 13 days showed every quality that the world would later call the ANZAC spirit. The refusal to quit, contempt for surrender, ferocious loyalty to one another, and a kind of cheerful stubbornness in the face of the impossible odds. The scale was different, but the spirit was not. Stories like this one, the ones that should be famous but somehow never quite made it to the textbooks, or we've forgotten about, are exactly what I write about every week in my free newsletter. There's a link in the description below. And if you want to support my channel, there are links for that as well in the description too. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing even more stories from British history with you very soon.